The fog that morning felt like the war itself, thick, shapeless, waiting to decide who it would swallow. I remember gripping the cold rim of the turret, the metal slick with dew, while the rest of the crew whispered inside the hull, like men sitting in a coffin. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray veil, Panthers were moving. We couldn't see them, but every man in my tank could feel them, the way the earth seemed to pulse with something heavier than thunder. They said those German machines were indestructible. Every report from Normandy had repeated the same nightmare. Shells bouncing off their sloped armor like pebbles, Shermans burning before the first round even reloaded. I had seen what a single Panther could do. And yet, that morning near Arracourt, we had orders to hold 50 American tanks waiting to face nearly 3 times as many Germans. No one told us we were carrying something new, something that might tilt the scales for the first time in months. 6 rounds, no different in color or weight to the rest, tucked deep into the rack beside the gunner's seat. Later, we'd learned they were M93 high-velocity armor-piercing shells, tungsten cord, forged in American factories, that never slept. But at dawn on September 19th, 1944, they were just 6 unknown pieces of metal, and I didn't know they would change everything I believed about survival. The fog was so thick I could taste it, diesel mixed with wet grass, mud, and fear. Our Sherman's engine hummed beneath us, low and steady, like a heart trying to hide its panic. "Panthers out there," my gunner murmured, eyes pressed to the periscope. "Can't see a damn thing." He wasn't wrong. Visibility was barely 70 meters. Sound replaced sight. The muffled clank of distant treads, the rattle of German transmissions, the hiss of something vast moving with purpose. They said the Panther's armor was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, a geometry of death. We'd tested our 75 millimeter shells back in England, and I'd watched them ricochet off practice plates like stones off a church roof. Even our new 76 millimeters guns, the ones Eisenhower had once called the wonder weapon, couldn't touch that glacis frontally. We were told to flank, to dance around the monster's sides like matadors, if we ever hoped to kill it. That was the plan, if we lived long enough to try. I checked my watch. 7:45. The mist hadn't lifted. Every minute that passed felt like an hour of waiting for a storm you couldn't see but knew was coming. In my mind, I replayed the endless discussions from months earlier. Men in clean uniforms arguing about guns and angles, while crews like mine burned in Normandy hedgerows. Someone had underestimated how many Panthers Hitler would send to France. They'd expected a handful. We got hundreds. Our tank was a 76 millimeters Sherman M4A1, with its round cast hull and new gun. It was supposed to give us hope. Instead, it felt like an apology. My loader, Redman, wiped his hands on his pants and looked up at me through the hatch. "Hey, Lieutenant," he whispered. "You think this'll be it? You think this fog means they can't see us, neither?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. In truth, I hoped the fog would hide us from everything, from the Panthers, from the odds, from history itself. Then the radio cracked to life, a burst of static followed by a clipped voice. "Captain Lamison, Company C. All units hold position. They're coming." The last words barely finished before the ground began to vibrate. Through the periscope, the gunner spotted a shadow, a shape too square, too deliberate to be anything but German. 75 meters ahead, moving slow, black cross faint against the mist. "Panther," he breathed. The sound of that word made the inside of the tank feel smaller, the air heavier. I didn't think. I ordered. "HVAP. Load HVAP." Redman froze. "The what?" he said. I glanced down at the rack 6 unfamiliar rounds, each capped with a dull, silver tip. "The new ones," I said. "The tungsten ones. Try it." He slid one into the breech, the metallic click echoing like a prayer. The Panther turned its turret slow, deliberate, confident. It hadn't seen us yet. For a second, the fog thinned, and I saw its long 75 millimeters KOK-42 gun, a weapon that could kill us from 2,000 meters if the air were clear. The thought made my throat tighten. Range 75, my gunner whispered. Fire. The recoil slammed through the Sherman, a metallic punch that shook my teeth. The flash lit the fog in amber. I saw the tungsten core streak across the gray like lightning, then a sound I will never forget. A sharp crack, not a bounce. A deep, metallic scream, and then silence. The Panther didn't fire back. Through the smoke, its gun sagged, barrel dipping like a bow. A heartbeat later, fire burst from the turret ring. The hatch exploded upward, trailing smoke and black debris. We had killed a Panther frontally. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Redmond laughed a raw, shocked sound. Holy hell, we actually got him. I didn't answer. I just watched the burning wreck through the fog, thinking how many men had died trying to do what we'd just done. That morning I realized something had changed, not just in the war, but in the way we believed. The Germans had their armor, their angles, their science. But we had something they didn't expect. A small, dense heart of tungsten, fired by a crew too stubborn to keep dying quietly. The fog thickened again, hiding the wreck. I heard the loader's voice in the dark hull. 5 left. 5. And somewhere ahead, at least 40 Panthers still waiting. Months before that morning at Arracourt, I had watched a 75mm shell bounce off a Panther's front plate at point-blank range. The sound was like hitting a church bell, clear, final, mocking. The round spun away into the dirt, and the German tank turned its turret with the slow, patient certainty of a predator that knows nothing can hurt it. That was Normandy, July 1944, and we were just beginning to realize that our armor and our faith were thinner than the metal we rode in. The M4 Sherman had carried us from Africa through Italy, and many of us had grown up believing it was enough. It was simple, reliable, mobile, everything a soldier could love in a machine meant to survive hell. But against the Panther, the Sherman was a toy. The German gun, the 75mm KOK-42, could punch through our front armor at over 2,000 meters. Meanwhile, our shells, even the new M62 armor-piercing rounds, just skidded off their 80mm sloped glacis plate like rain on glass. When the first reports came in from France, nobody in command wanted to believe them. "You must be hitting at bad angles," the engineers said. "The 76mm can do the job." But tankers don't argue theory. They count the number of friends they have left. I still remember the day Eisenhower found out. July 2nd, 1944. The message went up the chain. "Our 76 won't knock Panthers out." The story says he slammed his fist on the table, eyes blazing. "You mean to tell me the Wonder Gun can't kill them?" He'd been promised by ordnance officers that the new 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Instead, it was bouncing shells off the Panthers like tennis balls. By then, we knew what those promises were worth. Men in Washington dealt in reports and calculations. We dealt in minutes of survival once a Panther spotted you. I'd seen a whole platoon vanish because the first round missed, and there was no time for a second. In those weeks after Normandy, something shifted in the tone of our letters home. No one wrote about victory anymore, just about angles, smoke screens, and how to make a Sherman move faster in reverse. You learned to recognize the high-pitched scream of a Panther shell before it hit. You learned that every hill might be hiding one, and that the first one to shoot was almost always the one to live. The problem wasn't the courage of our men, it was physics. The Germans had built the Panther as a fortress on tracks, a direct response to the Soviet T-34. They sloped the armor, multiplied its effective thickness to nearly 140mm, and gave it a gun that could tear through anything on wheels. Our shells hit and ricocheted, leaving white streaks on the steel. Every bounce was a reminder that we were fighting an enemy who had learned faster. By late June, commanders began demanding the new 76mm Shermans waiting in Britain. They had been sitting idle for months, withheld because of logistics, training issues, and the belief that the old 75mm guns were good enough. Someone had said the crews weren't ready for new equipment. Maybe. But we were ready to die in the old ones. When the 76mm finally arrived in July, we expected salvation. It wasn't. Against Panzer IVs and Stugs, yes, the gun was superb. But the first time we fired at a Panther, the truth hit harder than the recoil. The shell simply ricocheted. The tank didn't even flinch. I remember our gunner staring at the impact mark through his scope. "Sir," he whispered. "That was a dead hit." Then, as if trying to convince himself, "We'll get him on the next one." But there was no next one. The return shot ripped through our flank armor like it was paper. We survived, but we crawled out of the hatch shaking, our ears ringing, faces blackened with powder. It's strange how fast pride evaporates when you realize your best weapon can't hurt your enemy. After that, flanking became our religion. If you wanted to live, you didn't fight the Panther from the front, you found its side, or you waited for artillery, or you prayed for a P-47 overhead. The manuals didn't say that, but every survivor knew. And yet, somewhere far from the mud and smoke, a group of men in white coats had already begun to solve the problem, not with new tanks, but with new metal. They were metallurgists, ballistics engineers, and sleepless chemists, staring at tungsten cores and test plates, trying to rewrite what was possible. We didn't know their names, we never saw their faces. But every round that failed in Normandy pushed them harder. They worked with samples of tungsten carbide no larger than a child's marble, but to us, they might as well have been building hope atom by atom. By autumn, rumors began to circulate, whispers passed in mess tents and field depots. "New ammo's coming," someone said. "High velocity. Punches through anything." No one believed it at first. We'd heard that kind of talk before. But when the first crates arrived marked T4 HVAP, handle with care, we started to wonder if maybe this time, science was about to save us where steel had failed. We still didn't know that the cost of each round could be measured not just in dollars or tungsten, but in the desperation of an entire army trying to claw back its edge. And in a few weeks, on that fog-covered morning near Arracourt, we would find out exactly what that edge could do. War teaches you that miracles are never free. Every new weapon has a price, and sometimes that price is mined out of the earth halfway across the world by people who will never know your name. The M93 HVAP round, the one that would later roar through the fog at Arracourt, was born from desperation, science, and a race against time fought not with guns, but with furnaces. By the spring of 1944, American engineers were running out of answers. They had built a tank gun that couldn't keep up with the enemy's armor. They had improved propellant charges, reshaped shell caps, even experimented with new alloys. Still, the numbers didn't lie. The 76mm gun was failing against the Panther's glacis at every realistic range. The problem wasn't power, it was density. Someone in the ordnance department said it plainly, "We can't beat them with steel. We need something harder than fear itself." That something turned out to be tungsten carbide, a metal so dense it felt heavier than it looked, as if gravity itself favored it. Tungsten was rare, found mostly in the mountains of southern China and a few veins in the American West. Before the war, it had been used to make cutting tools, drill bits, machine edges, nothing glamorous, just quiet precision. Now that same metal would be asked to decide tank duels on the other side of the world. At a proving ground in Aberdeen, Maryland, metallurgists worked under halogen lamps until dawn. They sliced cross-sections of failed shells, studying how ordinary steel caps splintered on sloped armor. The men wore long coats, their faces ghostly under the lights, speaking in the low language of stress fractures and kinetic transfer. One of them, a short, quiet man named Hughes, later told a correspondent, that he felt like he was designing a bullet for a god. What they built was simple in principle, savage in purpose. A shell with a tungsten heart wrapped in aluminum flesh. The tungsten core concentrated mass, allowing it to strike like a hammer, while the lighter body gave it velocity. Fired from the 76mm M1 gun, it could reach speeds over 1,000 meters per second, nearly 250 faster than the standard round. At that speed, even air seemed to flinch. On paper, it could pierce 160 millimeters of armor at close to a kilometer, enough to punch through the curved mantlet of a Panther and ignite the ammunition behind it, enough to make every tanker who had ever cursed a ricochet feel something close to justice. But paper calculations meant nothing if there wasn't enough tungsten to make the shells. America's access to tungsten depended on Chinese mines, many in regions already bleeding under Japanese occupation. Getting it out meant smuggling ore through mountains under constant threat of ambush. It meant trading with local warlords, paying in gold, rifles, sometimes morphine. Every grain of tungsten carbide that reached the U.S. had already traveled through fire, betrayal, and luck. Back home, the material was rationed like oxygen. Factories in Colorado and Nevada tried to supplement imports, but it wasn't enough. Tungsten was also needed for machine tools, for aircraft engines, for other calibers of armor-piercing ammunition. There wasn't enough metal in the world to give every tank crew the advantage we needed. By July 1944, production of 76mm HVAP rounds could be measured not in crates, but in handfuls. 1,000 rounds in August. Another 1,000 in September. That's less than what a single armored division could fire in a day. Not until November did the numbers climb to 5,000 per month. By then, men were already dying in the hedgerows, still firing shells that bounced. I once met a supply officer who described it perfectly. Each HVAP round was a promise we couldn't afford to make. In the field, a Sherman might get 6 of them, 6 silver-tipped rounds amid dozens of ordinary steel shells. Crews called them lifelines. Some painted small white crosses on the casings for luck. Others refused to load them until they saw the black cross of a Panther through their sights. We didn't know any of that in the beginning. All we saw were strange rounds arriving in wooden crates, stamped T4, experimental, handle with care. They gleamed faintly under lamplight, almost delicate. We didn't realize we were looking at the product of hundreds of sleepless nights in factories from Illinois to California, the result of thousands of men and women pouring molten hope into brass. Every HVAP shell cost more than a man's monthly pay, and still, there were too few. A Sherman company with 17 tanks might receive 85 rounds total, 85 chances to even the odds. 85 opportunities to turn fear into firepower. The irony was that, while our factories strained to produce tungsten, Germany was starving for it. Their own tungsten mines were gone or under Allied control. Imports from Sweden and Portugal had dwindled. What little they had left was hoarded for machine tools. Their tank crews were told to rely on standard steel core ammunition. Both sides understood what tungsten meant, not just as a metal, but as a message. Whoever could afford density could afford dominance. When I think back now to those 6 rounds in our Sherman's rack, I realize they represented more than firepower. They were the weight of an empire's industrial will, 6 tiny cores that carried the work of continents. Men died mining them, smelting them, shipping them, and on that gray morning in France, we were about to spend them like coins in a machine that decided who lived through the day. We never thought of it as science or strategy. In the turret, it was simpler than that. We just wanted something that finally worked. By September 1944, France was a patchwork of mud and ghosts. Every field smelled of cordite and unburied iron. Patton's Third Army had clawed its way east, its tanks grinding down roads that had once been vineyards. We were chasing a rumor that if we moved fast enough, the war might end before winter. But the Germans weren't done. They were gathering again, this time near a small, mist-drenched village called Arracourt. They had orders from Berlin to crush us there. 2 entire panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th fresh from the factories, their crews still green but their machines immaculate. Each Panther that rolled westward shone like it had been baptized in oil, its sloped armor untouched by battle, its gun barrel black as promise. To them, we were exhausted Americans in worn-out Shermans, spread too thin, running out of fuel and luck. They didn't know that some of us carried a secret buried in the racks beneath our feet. 6 tungsten hearts waiting to test whether theory could kill myth. The morning of September 19th began with a fog so dense you could hear it breathing. It hung low and heavy, thick enough to swallow sound, so that the clatter of tread seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Our position was south of the village, on a gentle rise overlooking the fields. The night before, Captain Lamison had briefed us by lantern light maps spread across an ammo crate, the flame throwing shadows across tired faces. "Panthers will be coming straight through here," he'd said, tapping the map. "They think we're retreating. We're not. We'll hold and make them come to us. Each tank has 6 HVAP rounds. Use them wisely. Aim for the mantlet, or don't bother shooting." The mantlet. That curved shield around the Panther's gun. The one soft spot, if you could call it that. We had memorized its silhouette like a prayer. That night I'd lain awake on the tank's deck, staring at the stars through thin mist, trying not to imagine how dawn would sound. The air reeked of gasoline and damp leather. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called absurdly peaceful against the constant growl of distant engines. When dawn came, it didn't rise, it seeped, a pale gray light that turned men into silhouettes. My crew was silent, each man lost in his own ritual. Redman kissed the dog tag he kept for his brother. Evans, the gunner, checked the elevation mechanism 3 times, though it didn't need checking. I watched the fog swirl around the barrel of our 76 millimeters and thought about how absurd it was that one piece of tungsten might stand between life and oblivion. Then came the sound, faint, rhythmic, metallic, tracks, lots of them. "Panthers," Evans whispered. The first ones appeared like phantoms, dark shapes emerging from the fog, barely 70 meters away, moving in column. They didn't know we were there yet. We could see their breath in the mist, the faint shimmer of heat from their engines. To the Germans, it must have felt like advancing through clouds toward certain victory. I gave the order softly, almost reverently. "Load HVAP." The breech slammed shut with a sound that cracked the air. I could feel my pulse sinking with the engine. The fog glowed faintly orange from the Panther's muzzle flash. They had spotted movement somewhere to our right and fired first. The ground trembled. Dirt rained down from the tank's roof. 75 meters. "Gun mantlet," Evans said, voice low, steady. "Fire." The recoil punched through my spine. The tungsten round sliced the fog, and half a heartbeat later came the impact, a deep, thunderous crack followed by a bloom of black smoke. The Panther jerked, halted, then erupted in a fireball that painted the fog red. Redmond let out a hoarse laugh. "Got him! Jesus, we actually—" "Shut it! Another one!" I shouted. 2 more Panthers emerged, firing wildly. One round screamed over our heads, close enough to make the air whistle. We pivoted, fast, the turret whining. Evans fired again. Another HVAP, another hit, this time straight through the mantlet. The tank stopped moving. Fire rolled out through its commander's hatch like the breath of a dying dragon. The 3rd Panther turned, trying to withdraw into the fog. I could see its side armor thinner, vulnerable. "Take him!" I barked. The shell struck low, near the engine deck. Flames shot out, orange through the gray, a brief furnace in the mist. Then silence. 3 Panthers gone in under 2 minutes. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Only the sound of the engine idling, the hiss of rain on burning steel. I leaned against the turret rim, feeling the vibration of the machine under my hands. This wasn't luck. This was proof. The tungsten cores had done what the old shells never could. They had punched through German pride itself. Somewhere to the north, other Shermans were fighting the same invisible war. Later we'd learn they too were scoring kills at ranges once thought impossible. The fog that morning had turned the battlefield into a blind man's duel, and our new rounds were the sharper sword. By noon, the sky began to clear. The sun broke through, revealing a landscape littered with blackened wrecks. The smell was everywhere: fuel, scorched paint, and something worse, the smell no one talks about but everyone remembers. When I climbed out of the hatch, I saw them German tankers, young, stunned, walking toward our lines with their hands up. They looked at our Shermans like men seeing ghosts. One of them, barely older than a boy, kept staring at the wreck of his Panther and muttering in disbelief. Unmöglich, unmöglich, impossible. That word followed me for years. Because for the first time since Normandy, the impossible had broken, and we were the ones holding the pieces. When the fog began to lift that afternoon, the battlefield looked like a dream that refused to end. The wreckage of Panthers lay smoking across the fields of Lorraine, their great turrets twisted at grotesque angles, black smoke mixing with the last ribbons of mist. The silence that followed was not peace, it was disbelief. For months we had been told the Panther was invincible, and now its armor lay cracked open like a myth finally proven mortal. Every Sherman crew along the line seemed to feel the same thing at once. A weight had lifted, not from their tanks, but from their souls. No one spoke of it openly, but the air hummed with something new: confidence, the kind of belief that changes the way a man breathes. That morning, when our first HVAP shell had torn through a Panther's mantlet, I had thought it was luck. But as the battle unfolded, luck became pattern, and pattern became doctrine. Across Arracourt, American gunners began aiming higher, not at the thick glacis plate, but at the curved gun mantlet where the armor's geometry betrayed itself. And when the tungsten core struck true, it tore through both steel and arrogance. Radio chatter told the story better than any report. Panther down, another burning. God Almighty, it worked. I can still hear the static between those words, the stunned laughter, the disbelief turning to something like hope. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake a quieter thought. There were only 5 HVAP rounds left in our tank. 6 had felt like a miracle. 5 felt like a countdown. Every shell we fired was a choice, a question of whether the next one was worth spending what the whole world had fought to make. The Germans regrouped by mid-morning. They came again, this time with better spacing, their Panthers fanned across the fields in careful lines. The fog was thinning now, and that meant they could see us as clearly as we saw them. Lameson's voice crackled over the radio. "C Company, hold your fire till they cross the ridge. Make every round count." We waited. 60 meters, 50, 40. Fire. Our gun barked again, the recoil slamming into my chest. The shell hit square, low on the turret face. The Panther kept coming, smoke pouring from its seams, its gun jerking upward in reflex before freezing mid-turn. Then came the explosion, a muted roar, followed by the slow slump of the turret as it separated from the hull. I realized my hands were trembling, though not from fear. It was something sharper, a kind of awe. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were winning. By late morning, word began to spread through the battalion like wildfire. Reports came in from the 37th Tank Battalion and the M18 Hellcat crews. Panthers burning, German assaults breaking. A few of the younger tankers started calling the HVAP Angel rounds. I didn't correct them. Maybe that was exactly what they were, little miracles encased in brass. For the Germans, it was different. Prisoners captured that day spoke of panic. Their officers had told them American shells couldn't pierce their armor. They had gone into battle believing themselves untouchable. When the first Panthers exploded, confusion rippled through their ranks faster than orders could. Some crews refused to advance, Others fired blindly into the fog, thinking they faced new weapons or British fireflies. One captured lieutenant kept repeating that it was impossible. Die Amerikaner haben nichts, das kann das tun. The Americans have nothing that can do this. They were wrong. We did. And we'd only just learned it ourselves. Still, victory was never as clean as the photographs that came later. The fields around Arracourt were slick with mud and oil, the air thick with the stench of burning rubber and men. By noon, our eyes burned from the smoke. The metal of the turret was hot to the touch. I had to force myself to think clearly, to remember that for every Panther we destroyed, there were still dozens out there. At one point, I climbed halfway out of the hatch and saw a P-47 streak overhead, its engine howling. It dipped low, rockets slicing into a German column beyond the ridge. The explosions rolled toward us like thunder. The sight of that plane, of our armor working with the skies again, made my throat tighten. For the first time in months, everything, air, artillery, tank, man, was moving together, as if war had rhythm instead of chaos. That night, when the fighting quieted, I sat on the hull of the Sherman and watched the horizon flicker orange where other battles still raged. Evans, the gunner, leaned against the turret beside me. His hands were black with soot. "You think we turned the tide today?" he asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the factory floors back home, the men melting tungsten into promise, the miners carving it out of mountains halfway across the world. I thought of all the times we had fled from those same Panthers, praying for something to change. "Maybe not the tide," I said finally, "but maybe the current." Below us, Redmond counted what we had left: 4 HVAP rounds, glowing faintly in the lamplight. He looked up and grinned. "4 left, Lieutenant. Guess we'd better make them famous." I smiled, though inside I knew the truth. Miracles fade fast on the front. By morning, we'd be back to smoke and mud and luck. But for one long day in September, a handful of American tankers had cracked the armor of a legend and changed the way every man in Europe looked at a Sherman. By the second day at Arracourt, the fog had begun to thin, but the disbelief still hung thick in the air. We could see the wrecks now, dozens of them, their hulks scattered across the valley like the bones of extinct beasts. Each burned-out Panther looked impossibly heavy, half sunk into the French soil, its armor torn open in ways the Germans swore couldn't happen. Every American tanker who passed one stared as if seeing a ghost that had finally been laid to rest. The radio reports came in waves: Panthers knocked out near Bazange, 2 more destroyed east of town, another ambush by the Hellcats along the ridge. We didn't know it then, but that day would end with 86 German tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. The miracle wasn't just that our rounds worked. It was that we had finally stopped believing the Germans were gods of steel. That shift happened quietly, like a breath being released. For months, the Panther had been a name that made men pause mid-sentence. You heard it, and you thought of flames, of shells bouncing uselessly, of comrades running for ditches. But after Arracourt, something changed. Now, when someone shouted, "Panther!" over the intercom, we didn't freeze. We loaded HVAP, we aimed, we fired. The truth spread faster than the ammunition itself. Tankers who hadn't even received HVAP rounds yet began to fight differently, as if just knowing such a weapon existed made their hands steadier. That's the part the historians never quite capture, the way belief itself becomes a weapon. Once we knew their armor could break, everything else began to follow. But on the other side of the battlefield, disbelief curdled into something darker. Captured German crews looked hollow-eyed, muttering about new American guns, about secret British fireflies. They couldn't accept that we'd beaten them with the same Shermans they had mocked as Tommy Cookers. Their intelligence officers thought we had 90mm cannons or Lend-Lease weapons smuggled in from the British. No one imagined that the difference was buried inside the ammunition racks, tiny tungsten hearts forged in American factories. One prisoner, a young Panzer commander with soot still smeared across his face, asked me through an interpreter, "How did you do it?" I wanted to tell him the truth, that it wasn't a trick, just hard work, stubborn engineers, and the quiet miracle of industrial will. But what came out instead was simpler, rougher. We stopped missing. He didn't believe me. Maybe he couldn't. The Germans had spent years convincing their tank crews that their machines were invincible, that if they just kept their fronts pointed toward the enemy, they could never die. But now, with mantlets pierced and turrets blown off, that illusion was bleeding out across the French mud. We learned later that the 113th Panzer Brigade, the same unit that had driven into us so confidently, had lost more than 2/3 of its strength in less than a week. Most of its surviving tanks were abandoned when the counterattack collapsed. The brigade had entered the battle with 90 armored vehicles. By September 29th, it had fewer than 20 that could still move. The victory reports would later call Arracourt a triumph of combined arms, of coordination between tanks, artillery, and air power. That was true. But in the turrets, what we felt was something simpler and more human. Relief. The kind that comes after months of fighting an enemy who seemed to live under a different set of rules. I remember sitting on the hull after the last Panther burned that day, the barrel still warm under my hand. Redman was smoking beside me, his face blackened, his grin crooked. Evans climbed out through the hatch, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting. "So that's it?" he said, looking at the smoking field. "That's what unbeatable looks like?" I didn't have an answer. The sight was almost pitiful, the supposed masters of armored warfare reduced to blackened carcasses. The air shimmered with heat from the fires, the ground trembling faintly as our own reinforcements rolled forward through the haze. Somewhere far overhead I heard the droning song of a P-47 circling, its shadow sliding over the ruins like a benediction. That evening, as we resupplied, I looked again at the 4 remaining HVAP rounds in the rack. Each one gleamed in the lamplight, delicate and deadly. It struck me that our entire battle, our entire shift in fortune, might have come down to fewer than a dozen shots across all our tanks. A few kilograms of tungsten had cracked the armor of German confidence and given ours back. Later, in the after-action briefings, they'd talk about logistics, flanking maneuvers, artillery coordination. But in the quiet of the tank that night, I thought of the human side of it, the way a handful of men in labs had given a handful of men in tanks the courage to breathe again. That's what Arracourt really was, not just a battle of machines, but of belief. The Panthers had been built on arrogance, our Shermans were rebuilt on necessity. And somewhere between those two truths, the myth broke. When dawn came again, the fields were quiet except for the crackle of cooling metal. The fog had lifted for good, and the sun fell across rows of silent wrecks that once ruled the battlefield. We didn't cheer. We just stared, knowing we had seen the moment when fear finally began to rust. When the snows came, they buried the wrecks at Arracourt, but not the memory of what had happened there. The Germans called it a defeat of weather and chance. We knew better. It was the beginning of something larger, a slow uncoiling of fear from every American crew that had once looked at a Panther and thought only of running. But victories don't stay clean for long. The war rolled on, and by December, the Ardennes had swallowed everything we thought we'd learned. The first week of that winter offensive felt like waking up inside a nightmare we'd already survived once. The forests were white, the sky gray, and the enemy everywhere. Hundreds of Panthers and Tigers pushed through the snow, their engines howling like winter beasts. They came fast, using the fog and cold the way we had used it at Arracourt. For a moment, it seemed the old terror was back, that the myth we'd broken was rising from the ice. The HVAP rounds, the tungsten miracles that had given us courage, were now scarcer than ever. Supply lines froze, convoys were ambushed, and the same snow that hit us also strangled our fuel trucks. Each Sherman crew was lucky to have 2 or 3 rounds left. We rationed them the way a dying man rations breath. I remember one night outside Bastogne, crouched in the half-frozen mud beside our tank, listening to the creak of distant treads in the trees. Evans sat beside the gun, his gloved hand resting on the breech like a priest on an altar. "Two left," he whispered. "Two for God and the devil to fight over." When the first German shells came, they sounded softer in the snow, almost polite until they hit. The trees exploded into splinters. We fired our standard rounds first, more out of habit than hope. They sparked harmlessly against the white armor ahead. Then, when the silhouette of a Panther loomed through the sleet, I gave the order, "HVAP, now." The tungsten round screamed out, the tracer cutting a clean line through the storm. It hit low on the turret face, right where the snow had begun to melt on its armor. The flash lit up the forest like summer lightning. When the echo faded, the Panther was a broken shape slumped in the snow, its fire muffled by the cold. Evans exhaled, a long cloud of steam in the dark. "One left," he said. We fought like that for days, scraping, moving, striking, retreating. There was no grand plan anymore, just survival wrapped in exhaustion. The fog of Lorraine had turned into the blizzard of the Ardennes, and every engagement felt like gambling with ghosts. Somewhere deep behind the lines, staff officers debated how to allocate what few HVAP shipments made it through. Tank destroyer units, they decided, got priority. Shermans would have to make do. Orders are easier to write than to live by. Out there in the snow, priority was a word that died in the cold before it reached us. More than once, we fired our last tungsten round, not out of tactics, but out of spite, a final defiance against a war that kept demanding proof of our worth. When the shell hit true, when another Panther folded in on itself, it wasn't triumph we felt. It was relief, the kind that makes a man close his eyes for half a second longer than he should. But not every crew was as lucky. I saw Shermans burned where they stood, black smoke curling into a sky that wouldn't stop snowing. I saw tankers walking out of the white woods alone, faces blank, uniforms frozen stiff. You could tell the ones who had run out of HVAP. They carried an emptiness you couldn't refill. Then, finally, the skies cleared. The P-47 seconds returned, silver wings cutting through the pale clouds. They strafed the German columns, rocket trails carving straight lines through the frozen valleys. The sound of those planes was the sound of salvation. We cheered them until our throats were raw. By January, the German advance stalled. Their fuel was gone, their supply lines in ruins. The Panthers that had terrified us in summer now stood abandoned along the roads, their tracks half buried in snow, their crews dead or fled. I remember walking past one, a Panther still gleaming under frost, its hatch open. Inside, the gunner's gloves were frozen to the controls. The shell hole in the mantlet was clean, surgical, almost beautiful. I knew that pattern. It was Tungsten's signature, sharp, merciless, final. I touched the edge of the hole with my glove and felt nothing but cold metal. Somewhere beneath all the snow and silence, I realized how much this war had depended on things most men never saw: the right alloy, the right angle, the right moment of courage. When spring finally came, the snow melted to reveal what the winter had hidden: the cost of everything. Fields littered with twisted tanks, burnt trees, helmets half buried in mud, but also something else. Rows of Shermans still moving east, engines roaring, crews smiling through the grime. We were still alive. The tungsten hearts we'd carried had burned bright enough to get us through the dark. And though the Germans had built monsters, we had learned how to kill them not with bigger guns or thicker armor, but with belief, forged in laboratories and tested in blood. As we crossed into Germany, I looked back once more at the trail behind us, a line of black scars on white ground, and I thought, maybe this is what victory really looks like. Not clean, not noble. Just surviving long enough to see the snow melt. The war ended the way most storms do, not with silence, but with a strange kind of stillness, as if the world were holding its breath. When the guns stopped, we didn't cheer. We just listened to the quiet and tried to remember what it sounded like to be alive, without waiting for something to explode. By then, we'd crossed the Rhine. The Panthers were gone. The roads littered instead with their skeletons, machines that had once seemed immortal, now just rusting testimonies to the limits of arrogance. I remember standing beside one wreck outside Kassel in April '45. Its mantlet still bore a perfect hole, clean-edged, the metal curled inward like petals of steel. I could tell instantly it had been a tungsten hit HVAP, the unmistakable mark of speed and density conquering armor. The crew inside hadn't stood a chance. I should have felt triumph, but all I felt was the weight of it. Every hole like that had been paid for in sweat, ore, and lives. Later, after Germany surrendered, they made us tour the factories, the Panther assembly lines. Rows of half-finished hulls lay silent under skylights, shattered by bombs. I walked among them, my boots echoing on the concrete. The myth of German invincibility had been forged here, on these floors, with machines that once roared with precision. But even as I looked at them, I realized the real weapon of the war hadn't been built here. It had been built back home, in the quiet places in foundries, test ranges, and laboratories that never stopped burning their lights. The ordnance men came later, to study the wrecks. They took measurements, sketched angles, collected data. They found what we already knew. The HVAP rounds had worked best against the Panther's gun mantlet, not its glacis. Even tungsten had limits. At longer ranges, the cores shattered. At close ones, they bored through like light through glass. It was imperfect, but it was enough, and enough, in war, can decide the world. By February '45, we'd learned to treat HVAP not as a miracle, but as a tool, one piece in the great machine of combined arms that had become our doctrine. The planes, the artillery, the engineers, the fuel convoys, all of it mattered more than any single round. But still, in the turret of a Sherman, you never forgot what it felt like to hold one of those silver-capped shells. It wasn't just ammunition. It was proof that somewhere, far away, people you'd never meet were still fighting for you in their own way with microscopes instead of rifles, with equations instead of courage. When I came home years later, I found a single HVAP casing on a shelf in an ordnance museum. It gleamed faintly under the light, smaller than I remembered. The plaque beneath it said, "High-velocity armor piercing, M93, used in the M4 Sherman, 1944-45, provided capability against Panther and Tiger tanks." I stared at it for a long time. It was strange, seeing an entire chapter of terror and survival condensed into one piece of brass behind glass. But the story didn't end there. 5 years later, the same round, or rather its descendant, was firing again, this time in Korea. The old Shermans, now called Easy 8s, went up against Soviet-built T-34 seconds. And just like before, the tungsten hearts didn't fail. The 76mm guns cut through their armor cleanly, almost effortlessly. What we had bled to invent in Europe had finally arrived in abundance in Asia. I read about it in a newspaper back home. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The scientists and generals gave it names, statistics, doctrines. But for those of us who'd been there, it was simpler. The HVAP round had been born from fear, the kind of fear that drives men to build something impossible, and like all weapons of desperation, it had outlived the moment it was meant for. In later years, I met younger officers who talked about tank design as if it were math velocity equations, armor slope angles, penetration charts. They spoke of new materials, depleted uranium, composite sabots, fin-stabilized penetrators. I listened and smiled. They were just giving new names to an old lesson. The physics hadn't changed since 1944 mass, speed, density, and willpower. Everything else was ornament. When the M1 Abrams came along decades later, bearing the name of my old commander, I understood the poetry in it. Abrams had led us at Arracourt calm, calculating, unshakable, the kind of leader who made courage feel contagious. The tank that carried his name bore a 120mm gun and shells that flew faster than sound, their cores made of uranium instead of tungsten. I watched footage of it one night on the news muzzle flash, bright as sunrise, armor-piercing rounds, slicing through targets that vanished in sparks. I remember thinking, that's our old tungsten heart, just beating faster. Sometimes I still dream of the fog at Arracourt, the smell of wet earth and diesel, the faint taste of smoke in my mouth, the sound of Redman's voice counting the remaining rounds. 5 left, he'd said. 5. It was such a small number, and yet it had changed the course of a war. If there's one thing the years have taught me, it's that victory isn't measured by who had the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It's measured by who kept adapting when they had nothing left to give. We weren't stronger than the Germans. We were just more willing to learn while bleeding. And in that fog, on that morning when the first HVAP shell punched through a myth, we learned what every generation of soldier must, that the line between fear and hope is as thin as the tungsten core of a single round, and sometimes that's enough to win.